there's a certain characteristic of people who have been influenced by Fethullah Gulen that is incredibly beautiful. There's a serenity and a peacefulness and a dedication, a generosity of spirit. Characteristic of people who are influenced by envisioning a new world where I didn't know about this custom. I said, sure, we'll be happy to do that. My name is Bud Friend Jones. I'm the senior minister at the First Congregational Church of Crystal Lake, which is a suburb of Chicago. I've been there since 2006, and I've been an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ for 43 years. And I've been involved in interfaith work pretty much since 2001. In 2006, I moved here to Chicago and started my work in Crystal Lake when the executive director of the Niagara Foundation, and I had never heard of the Niagara Foundation, the executive director, Kemal Bey, called me on the phone and said, would I like for him to be my neighbor? I didn't understand this, but he said, it was January, and he said that they wanted to bring us pudding, Noah's pudding. And I didn't know about this custom, but I said, well, sure. We'll be happy to do that. And he said, well, how many are you? And I said, well, there are probably going to be 400 people in our worship service on a January day. So he said, no problem, we'll bring you 400 bowls of pudding. I was surprised, and on the coldest day of the year, when the temperatures were well below zero and everybody was freezing, the car drives up, I should say a couple of cars drive up with hundreds of bowls of Noah's pudding. And they explained to us what this was about, this whole idea of neighborliness and of sharing with each other and of being together. They came into our worship service and they noticed that in our hymnal, we had the 99 names, the sacred names, in one of the pages in our hymnal. It just happened to open to that page on that day. We wouldn't necessarily do that every day. But it was a very nice moment of connection. And out of that grew the most wonderful partnership. When I was in Atlanta, and active in Interfaith and working with Istanbul Center, I had no idea of who Fethullah Gulen is or what Hizmet is. This was something that I would come to know later. It's not something that they didn't have signs everywhere saying, you know, this is who we are. But the people of Istanbul Center and of Niagara, and I found also in other cities I visited, in Salt Lake City, for example, there's a certain characteristic of people who have been influenced by Fethullah Gulen that is incredibly beautiful. There's a serenity and a peacefulness and a dedication, a generosity of spirit. It's what we would hope Christians would be like at our best if we practiced our faith as much as we teach it. There's always this great hospitality, the sense of welcome, the sense of we wanting to be of service to others. So I learned more about it when I came to Chicago and when I went to Turkey with a group from Niagara Foundation and got to visit people in their homes, professionals and non-professionals in their homes, who went out of their way to cook food for us and welcome us and just embrace us. And we met went to the Writers Foundation in Istanbul. And I remember we were led by a young man named Hakan Bey, who was teaching us all along as we went along. And we ran into something called kimsi yokmu, meaning something like is there anybody there? And it was an outreach movement of the Gulen Movement, of Hizmet. Hakan gave us a little speech, and he said, if you give the first, I think it's called zakat, 2.5% of your income, of your net worth per year, that's not your money. He said, that's God's money. That's God's money, and that belongs to God, and so you give it to him. You don't expect any credit for that or anything else. That's God's money, and you return it. If you give over the 2.5%, then you're beginning to be generous. And I thought, what a marvelous stewardship sermon that would be for me to give in my church. We do expect a certain percentage too, but we rarely get it. And then to say that generosity doesn't begin at zero, it begins after you've given what God already expects. It was a marvelous learning and experience for me. I am so impressed with the kind of work that's done by Hizmet around the world, and where there is pain. In Christian faith, Jesus said, "It's by their fruit you will know them." And I look at the Gulen movement and at the fruit it has produced, and I think it's really a remarkable organization worldwide. Now, a lot of us look at it and say, how did this happen? This is a worldwide organization. This is an organization, or it's not an organization. I mean, that's it doesn't have an organizational structure. There's no corporate chart. There's no, so it's a little bit hard to understand how all of these organizations around the world are connected. We don't understand that. We look at it, but it's very impressive. Publishers, for example, some of the most beautiful art books in the world are published by Gulen publishers. Education, schools, how many schools? Hundreds and hundreds of schools in America, in Europe, in Japan, in Africa, schools. And not just schools, but the best schools, and really teaching the very, really reaching for excellence in education and in accomplishment. And I understand also schools for girls in tribal areas where that is not always welcomed or expected. Taking that extra step to make sure that young women receive the tools that they will need for their empowerment and for their living full lives. That's impressive and risky, I think, to see that happen. So the Hizmet movement seems to me to be about creating or envisioning a new world where people will be together in fellowship. Certainly, interfaith dialogue is at the heart of this movement, and we've seen that in every setting. When I was in Salt Lake City, who do you think succeeded in getting the Mormons to open their like most holy temple to the interfaith community? But I think it was certainly with help from the Gulen people who helped that to happen. They have ways of through their kindness, through their love, through their just intrinsic goodness of opening hearts. And when hearts open, then doors open, and things begin to happen. I think that generally speaking, what I see worldwide and in this country is very benign and good and worth supporting. For all my interaction with Niagara Foundation and Istanbul Center and other Gulen organizations, I have never had an opportunity to meet Fethullah Gulen in person, and I may never have that opportunity. I have read some of his work, and I appreciate very much his writing. I appreciate that he's an Islamic thinker who spoke out after the attacks on September 11 immediately. And in our country, for years after September 11, people kept saying, why aren't the Muslims speaking up? Why aren't the Muslims speaking up? And he did speak up, but he wasn't broadcast. He didn't have a microphone in his mouth, so to speak. And I always regretted that because he was one who did. I admire his vision of a world that's different from the one we have. And I know that when the century was changing, we were moving into a new millennium, he had a most beautiful speech about in the new millennium, we would be inevitably moving toward cooperation and dialogue, and that the world was moving beyond the kind of conflict between religions that we had had before. And at the same time, I was working on the Decade to Overcome Violence for the World Council of Churches, and that was our dream too. I mean, little did we realize that 14 years later, the world would have descended into such violence as we see today. And he too, it must break his heart to see what's happening around the world. It would be my hope to see Fethullah Gulen, while he is still vital and active and influencing the world, to have an opportunity to hook up with the new Roman Catholic Pope, Pope Francis, because I think in some ways their worldview is very similar. I would like to see them joined by the Dalai Lama, who himself is getting older and not as vital as he used to be, but still very much committed to a world of compassion and dialogue. I think these three people, and maybe some of the other wisdom traditions from Africa, from the indigenous Americans, from indigenous peoples in Australia, other peoples could come together and maybe give us the counsel or the wisdom of the elders at this point for the world. Tell the world, speak to us and invite us to change our ways, because we're headed down a path of mutual destruction, and we don't need to be, and that seems to be where he is.
I think in the modern world, since a lot of the spirituality has been secularized, what I like about the Hizmet movement is that it's a spiritual movement, but it also is attempting to help humanity unite.
I often think about it as Turkish Islam, but maybe it's Hizmet. There's a kind of hospitality. There's a great, maybe growing out of the Abrahamic traditions of that tent, Abraham's tent that's open on all the sides to all the peoples of the world. It seems to me the Gulen movement practices that.